Welcome back to another deep dive into the darker corners of human relationships. I am your host, Sleepless Miner. And tonight, we're exploring Reddit stories that will remind you why setting boundaries isn't just important, it's survival. Whether you're winding down after a long day or need something to occupy your restless mind, these tales of family betrayal, manipulation, and the courage to walk away will keep you company through the quiet hours. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin our journey through some of the most compelling relationship disasters the internet has to offer. I need to get this off my chest because I'm still processing what I did, and honestly, I don't know if I'm a monster or if I finally found my backbone. This happened 6 months ago, but the fallout is still destroying my family, and I can't decide if I care anymore. I'm 55. Divorced for 3 years after my ex-wife Linda made it crystal clear that my net worth wasn't keeping up with her expectations. She took our daughter Sophie with her, of course, and since then I've been the weekend dad who gets criticized for every decision while still being expected to fund everything. Sophie was 25 when the divorce happened, old enough to make her own choices. But she made it very clear whose side she was on. The thing about my daughter is that she's always been entitled. I know that sounds harsh, but it's true. Growing up, Linda made sure Sophie never faced consequences for anything. Bad grades, rude behavior, totaling 2 cars before she turned 21, none of it mattered because Daddy would fix everything with his checkbook. I enabled it too, I'll admit that. I worked 60-hour weeks building my consulting business so Sophie could have the best of everything. And somewhere along the way, she learned to see me as an ATM rather than a father. After the divorce, our relationship became even more transactional. She'd call when she needed money for rent, or when her credit cards were maxed out, or when she wanted to take some expensive vacation with her friends. I kept paying because I thought eventually she'd realize I was trying to maintain a connection with her. I thought the money was buying me time to rebuild our relationship. When Sophie got engaged to her boyfriend Marcus last year, I was genuinely happy for her. Marcus seemed like a decent guy, and I hoped marriage might mature her a bit. She'd been living in this extended adolescence, working part-time at a boutique while I covered most of her expenses, and I thought maybe having a husband would give her some perspective on adult responsibilities. Then came the wedding planning. Sophie had dreams, big dreams. She wanted the fairy tale wedding she'd been planning since she was 8 years old. The problem was that Marcus works in IT and makes a decent living, but not fairy tale wedding money. Sophie called me crying about how they'd have to settle for something small and disappointing, how all her friends were having these amazing celebrations while she'd have to compromise on everything she'd ever wanted. I made what I now realize was a massive mistake. I told her I'd pay for the wedding, not contribute to it, not help with some expenses. I told her I'd cover the entire thing because I wanted her to be happy, and I foolishly thought this grand gesture would somehow heal the damage between us. She cried happy tears on the phone and told me she loved me, and for a moment I felt like her father again, instead of just her bank account. The budget we discussed was $40,000. Not cheap, but not insane for the kind of wedding she wanted. Venue, catering, flowers, photography, music, dress, the works. She sent me Pinterest boards and magazine clippings, and honestly, seeing her excited about something that I was providing felt good. I hadn't seen her that enthusiastic about spending time with me in years. Here's where I made my second mistake. Sophie asked if she could handle all the vendor communication since she had such a specific vision for everything. I agreed because I figured it would be good for her to take some responsibility. And frankly, I didn't have time to micromanage every detail. I set up a dedicated account for wedding expenses and gave her access to coordinate payments. For months, everything seemed fine. She'd update me on progress, show me photos of dress fittings, ask my opinion on centerpiece options. I felt more involved in her life than I had since the divorce. I even started imagining walking her down the aisle, giving a father of the bride speech, having that moment of pride that divorced dads worry they'll never get. 3 weeks before the wedding, I realized I hadn't received an invitation. I mentioned it to Sophie during one of our phone calls, assuming it was an oversight. She got flustered and said she'd been meaning to drop one off, that she'd been so busy with final preparations. I didn't think much of it. Wedding planning is stressful, and I figured she had 1,000 details on her mind. 2 weeks before the wedding, I still hadn't received anything. When I asked again, Sophie said she'd mail it that day. Her voice sounded strange, almost guilty. But I was trying not to be the overbearing father who nitpicks every little thing. 1 week before the wedding, I made a decision that changed everything. I called the wedding planner directly. I'd never spoken to Rebecca, the planner Sophie had hired. But I figured since I was writing the checks, I should probably introduce myself and see if there were any last-minute expenses I needed to know about. The conversation started normally enough. Rebecca was professional, thanked me for my generosity, assured me everything was on track. Then I mentioned that I was looking forward to the ceremony and asked about timing for photos beforehand. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted so long I thought we'd been disconnected. Rebecca finally asked, very carefully, if Sophie had spoken to me recently about the guest arrangements. When I said no, she got even more uncomfortable. She started talking about how there had been some family complexities that she preferred not to get involved in, and that maybe I should discuss the details with Sophie directly. That's when I knew something was seriously wrong. I pressed her, explaining that I was paying for everything and had a right to know what was happening with my own daughter's wedding. Rebecca clearly didn't want to be in the middle of family drama, but she eventually admitted that my name wasn't on any of the guest lists she'd received. Not on the ceremony list, not on the reception list, not on the family photo schedule. Nothing. I asked her to email me copies of everything, and she initially refused, saying Sophie had instructed her to keep all communications confidential. I had to remind her that every payment for her services had come from my account before she agreed to send me the documentation. Reading those emails was like getting punched in the stomach. Not only was I not invited to my own daughter's wedding, but there were explicit instructions that I was not to be admitted to the venue under any circumstances. Sophie had told the security staff that there was a family restraining order and that I might try to disrupt the ceremony. There was no restraining order. There had never been any legal issues between us. She had simply decided to erase me from her wedding day, while still expecting me to pay for it. I sat in my office staring at those emails for probably an hour, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. $40,000. Months of planning. All these conversations about flowers and music and seating arrangements. And she had been planning to ban me from the event the entire time. I called Sophie immediately. The phone rang once before going to voicemail, which meant she'd deliberately declined the call. I left a message asking her to call me back because we needed to discuss the wedding arrangements. She didn't call back that day, or the next day, or the day after that. Finally, I drove to her apartment. I needed to look her in the eye and understand how she could do something this cruel. Marcus answered the door and immediately looked uncomfortable when he saw me. He mumbled something about Sophie being busy with last-minute preparations and tried to close the door, but I wasn't leaving without answers. Sophie appeared behind him, and I could see in her face that she knew I'd found out. There was no surprise, no guilt, just this cold defiance that I'd never seen from her before. I asked her directly why I wasn't invited to her wedding. Her response will be burned into my memory forever. She said, "Because I don't want you there. This is my day, and I want it to be perfect, and having you there would ruin it for me." I asked her how she could take my money while simultaneously planning to humiliate me. She said the money was the least I could do after putting her through the divorce, as if I had chosen to have my marriage fall apart. She said I should be grateful she was giving me the opportunity to do something meaningful for her since I'd been such a disappointment as a father. The cruelty in her voice was unlike anything I'd ever heard from her. This wasn't hurt or anger. This was calculated malice. She wanted to punish me, and she'd found the perfect way to do it. Take my money, exclude me from the celebration, and make me complicit in my own humiliation. I tried to reason with her, to explain how much this was hurting me, how I'd been looking forward to walking her down the aisle. She laughed and said I was being dramatic, that plenty of fathers don't attend their daughters' weddings, and that I should be proud I was contributing something useful for once. That's when I realized my daughter was gone. Not physically, but the person I thought I knew, the person I'd been trying to reconnect with, had never really existed. She saw me as nothing more than a source of funding, and she'd played me perfectly. I went home and called my attorney. Then I called every single vendor. The venue, the caterer, the florist, the photographer, the band, the cake decorator, everyone. I canceled everything. Not postponed, not rescheduled, canceled. I knew I wouldn't get most of the deposits back, and I didn't care. I'd rather lose the money than continue funding my own humiliation. The wedding was supposed to be on a Saturday. On Friday afternoon, I got a call from Rebecca, the wedding planner, panicking because vendors were calling her about cancellations. I told her very calmly that the person paying for the wedding had decided not to pay for the wedding anymore, and that any questions should be directed to the bride. Saturday morning, I turned off my phone and went fishing. I didn't want to be reachable when Sophie realized what had happened. When I finally turned my phone back on that evening, I had 37 missed calls and dozens of text messages. Sophie, Marcus, Linda, various relatives, family, friends, everyone had something to say about what I'd done. The messages ranged from furious to heartbroken to threatening. Sophie's message was the longest. She called me every name in the book, said I was vindictive and petty and cruel, said I'd ruined the most important day of her life out of spite. She said she'd never forgive me and never wanted to see me again. I wrote back a single sentence, but made it clear you never wanted to see me again. I just stopped paying for the privilege. It's been 6 months since Sophie's non-wedding. She and Marcus did end up getting married at a courthouse 2 weeks later, with just Linda and a few friends present. No reception, no photographer, no fairy tale celebration. I wasn't invited to that either, obviously. My family is completely divided. Some relatives think I went too far, that I should have been the bigger person and attended the wedding anyway, or worked things out beforehand. Others think Sophie got exactly what she deserved, and that I should have cut her off years ago. Linda has been calling me a monster to anyone who will listen, claiming I destroyed Sophie's dreams out of petty revenge. She conveniently leaves out the part where Sophie banned me from the wedding while expecting me to pay for it. Do I feel bad? Sometimes. I loved the idea of my daughter's wedding, and destroying that hurt me too. But I don't regret standing up for myself for once. Sophie wanted to use me and discard me, and I refused to let that happen. I know this makes me sound cold, but I'm actually sleeping better than I have in years. For the first time since my divorce, I'm not walking on eggshells trying to maintain a relationship with someone who obviously despises me. The price of Sophie's approval was my self-respect, and I finally decided it wasn't worth paying anymore. Sometimes the people closest to us know exactly which buttons to push, and sometimes they push too hard. I'm still processing what happened to me over the past few months, and I need to get this out because I feel like I'm going insane. My family thinks I'm overreacting, but I genuinely believe my sister and her husband were trying to essentially purchase my body. And I'm terrified of what might have happened if I hadn't gotten out when I did. I'm 30 years old, and I have a twin sister named Lily. We've always been incredibly close, that weird twin bond everyone talks about where we could practically read each other's minds growing up. I became a travel nurse after college, which has been amazing for me. I love the work. I love seeing different parts of the country, and honestly, I love the independence. Lily took a different path. She got married right out of college to her boyfriend Connor, and they've been trying to start a family for 6 years now. Connor comes from money, old family wealth, the kind where they have opinions about everything and expect those opinions to be treated as law. His family has always made it clear that they see Lily as acceptable but not ideal, if you know what I mean. She's pretty and sweet and agreeable, but she doesn't come from their social circle. I think they tolerate her because Connor chose her, but there's always been this undercurrent of judgment. The fertility struggles have been brutal for Lily. 6 years of tests, procedures, disappointments, and failed IVF attempts. Each failure seemed to make Connor's family a little colder toward her, as if her inability to produce an heir was a personal failing. I watched my sister transform from this confident, happy person into someone who apologized for her own existence. 3 months ago, Lily called me and asked if I could come visit. She sounded different, almost formal, which was weird for us. When I got to their house, Connor was there too, which should have been my first red flag. Lily and I usually hang out alone when I'm in town, but Connor insisted on being part of whatever conversation they wanted to have. They sat me down in their living room like this was some kind of business meeting. Lily was fidgeting with her hands, barely making eye contact, while Connor did most of the talking. He explained their situation, which I already knew, and then dropped the bomb. They wanted me to be their surrogate, not just carry their embryo, but actually conceive and carry Connor's biological child. They'd done their research, Connor said, and found that gestational surrogacy had better success rates when the surrogate was genetically similar to the intended mother. Since Lily and I are identical twins, I would be the perfect candidate to carry their baby. The way Connor explained it, it sounded almost clinical, like I was being recruited for some kind of medical study. He talked about compensation, about how they'd cover all my medical expenses, about how this would be a beautiful gift I could give my sister. Lily sat there nodding but looking miserable, and I got the distinct impression this conversation was more Connor's idea than hers. I told them I needed time to think about it, which seemed to annoy Connor. He started talking about biological clocks and optimal timing, about how they'd already wasted so much time and money on other approaches. But I held firm. This was a huge decision, and I wasn't going to be rushed into it. Over the next few days, I did a lot of research and soul-searching. The more I learned about surrogacy, the more uncomfortable I became with the idea. It's not just 9 months of pregnancy, it's a complete life change. Potential health risks, emotional complications, legal issues. The thought of being pregnant with my brother-in-law's child made me feel sick, but I also didn't want to completely shut the door on helping my sister. When I called them back, I offered a compromise. I would donate my eggs so they could attempt IVF using my genetic material and Connor's sperm, with Lily carrying the pregnancy. It seemed like the perfect solution, giving them the genetic similarity they wanted while allowing Lily to experience pregnancy and childbirth herself. Connor's reaction was immediate and hostile. He said egg donation wouldn't work, that they'd researched it extensively, and determined that surrogacy was their only viable option. When I asked for specifics about why egg donation wouldn't work, he got evasive and started talking about success rates and doctor recommendations. That's when I realized this wasn't really about maximizing their chances of having a baby. This was about control, about Connor's family getting exactly what they wanted, exactly how they wanted it. I told them I wasn't comfortable with surrogacy and that egg donation was my final offer. Lily looked devastated, but Connor got angry. He accused me of being selfish, of not understanding what family meant, of prioritizing my own convenience over my sister's happiness. He said they'd been counting on me, that I was their last hope, and that I was basically destroying their dreams by being stubborn. The conversation ended badly, with Connor storming out and Lily crying. I felt horrible, but I also felt like I'd made the right decision for myself. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. Over the next few weeks, Connor started what I can only describe as a harassment campaign. He would show up at my apartment unannounced, insisting we needed to talk more about the surrogacy option. He'd call me at work, claiming there were new medical developments I needed to hear about. He sent me articles about the joys of surrogacy, testimonials from happy surrogates, statistics about success rates. When I told him to stop contacting me, he got nastier. He started sending me messages about family loyalty, about how I was abandoning my sister in her time of need. He said his family had been generous enough to accept Lily despite her fertility issues, but that generosity had limits. He implied that if I didn't help them, they might reconsider their commitment to supporting Lily through more fertility treatments. The threats were subtle but clear. Connor's family was funding their attempts to have a child, and that funding could disappear if I didn't cooperate. That's when I started noticing strange things. I'd see the same car parked outside my building multiple days in a row. I'd get calls from numbers I didn't recognize that would hang up when I answered. My gym membership information somehow got mixed up, and my emergency contact was changed to Connor's number without my knowledge. The most disturbing discovery came when I requested copies of my medical records for a routine job requirement. Buried in the access logs were requests from a medical consulting firm that I'd never heard of. When I researched the company, it turned out to be owned by Connor's uncle, who apparently had been reviewing my health information without my consent. They weren't just pressuring me to be their surrogate. They were treating me like property they already owned, investigating my medical history, monitoring my daily routines, building a case for why I was the perfect candidate for their purposes. The entitlement some people feel toward other people's bodies is absolutely staggering. The idea that family obligation somehow extends to literally carrying someone else's child for 9 months shows just how twisted these dynamics can become. I realized I wasn't dealing with desperate prospective parents anymore. I was dealing with people who saw my body as a resource they had a right to access. The final confrontation happened at a grocery store near my apartment. I was picking up some basics after a long shift when I felt someone grab my arm from behind. It was Connor, and he looked furious. He dragged me toward a corner of the store where we wouldn't be overheard and started hissing at me about wasting time and being selfish. He said his family had invested too much in this plan to accept alternatives, that they'd already made arrangements with a fertility clinic, that they'd cleared space in their lives for a pregnancy that needed to happen soon. When I tried to pull away from him, he tightened his grip on my arm and said something that will haunt me forever. "You will give us what we deserve." This isn't a request anymore. The mask had completely come off. This wasn't about helping my sister have a baby. This was about Connor and his family acquiring what they saw as their property. They decided my body belonged to them, and they were prepared to use intimidation, emotional manipulation, and financial pressure to take what they wanted. I managed to get away from Connor and immediately drove to the police station. I filed a restraining order that same day, documenting everything from the harassment to the unauthorized access to my medical records. The officer taking my statement looked genuinely disturbed by some of the details, especially the medical records violation. The restraining order was approved within 48 hours, but the family fallout was immediate and devastating. Lily called me screaming, saying I'd destroyed her marriage and her last chance at happiness. She accused me of being jealous of her relationship, of never wanting her to have children, of making up stories about Connor to justify my selfishness. She chose him over me, which shouldn't have been surprising but still broke my heart. The last message I received from her was a text saying, "You've destroyed the only chance I had at happiness. I hope you're satisfied with yourself." I wasn't satisfied. I was heartbroken and terrified and angry all at the same time. I'd lost my twin sister, the person I'd been closest to my entire life, because I refused to let her husband and his family use my body as their personal incubator. Within a month, I'd transferred to a travel nursing assignment in a different state. I changed my phone number, closed my social media accounts, and essentially disappeared from their lives. I couldn't risk Connor finding me again, and I couldn't handle any more messages from Lily blaming me for ruining her dreams. It's been 3 months since I cut contact with them, and I'm still processing everything that happened. Some days I wonder if I overreacted, if I should have found a way to help my sister without giving Connor and his family what they wanted. But then I remember the look in Connor's eyes when he grabbed my arm, the entitled rage when I wouldn't submit to his demands, and I know I made the right choice. I loved my sister, but I loved myself more. And sometimes that has to be enough. Family manipulation often starts small, with little compromises that seem reasonable at the time. I'm 21 years old, and I've just discovered that my entire life has been built on a foundation of lies, manipulation, and family money that I never even knew existed. The worst part is watching my father scramble to fix relationships he destroyed while I was homeless and struggling to pay for ramen noodles. Let me start from the beginning. My dad, David, remarried 2 years ago to a woman named Jennifer who already had a 15-year-old daughter. Jennifer seemed nice enough at first, and I was genuinely happy that my dad had found someone after being alone for so long. My mom died when I was 12, and those 9 years of him being single were hard on both of us. When Jennifer moved in with her daughter, our house got pretty crowded. It's a nice 3-bedroom place, but with 4 adults, it was tight. I was starting my junior year of college and still living at home to save money, working part-time at a campus bookstore and trying to focus on my engineering degree. Things started getting weird about 6 months after Jennifer and her daughter moved in. My dad started making comments about how expensive it was to support everyone, how the grocery bills had doubled, how the utilities were through the roof. He'd never talked about money like that before, so I offered to contribute more around the house and pick up more hours at work. That's when he dropped the bomb. He said now that I was 21 and technically an adult, it was time I started paying rent if I wanted to continue living at home. $500 a month, plus helping with groceries and utilities. He made it sound like this was completely normal, like all parents charged their college-age kids rent. I was shocked, but tried to understand his perspective. Jennifer wasn't working. Her daughter was in high school, and supporting 4 people on his salary was probably difficult. I agreed to the arrangement even though it meant picking up a second job and basically killing myself trying to balance school, work, and sleep. For 8 months, I paid that rent religiously. $500 every month, plus groceries, plus helping with utilities. I was exhausted, my grades suffered, and I had 0 social life, but I thought I was being responsible and helping my family. Then, Jennifer got pregnant. I was actually excited about having a baby brother or sister. The age gap would be huge, but I thought it might be nice to have a little one around. What I didn't expect was what came next. 3 months into Jennifer's pregnancy, my dad sat me down for another money conversation. He said with the baby coming, they needed my room for a nursery. Jennifer's daughter needed her own space as a growing teenager, and they needed somewhere to put the crib, changing table, and all the baby equipment. I suggested we could look into converting the garage or finishing the basement, but he shot down every alternative I offered. The bottom line, he said, was that I needed to find somewhere else to live. He gave me 2 months' notice, like I was a tenant instead of his son. I was devastated. Not only was I losing my home, but I couldn't afford rent in the college town where I went to school. Even with my 2 jobs, I was barely scraping by with the arrangement we had. Finding an apartment, paying deposits, covering utilities, it was financially impossible. I called my Aunt Sarah, my dad's older sister, in tears. I explained the situation and asked if I could crash on her couch for a few weeks while I figured something out. Sarah was immediately suspicious about why my dad was kicking me out, but she said I could stay with her as long as I needed to. The conversation I had with Sarah that first night at her house changed everything. She asked me detailed questions about my living situation, about the rent I'd been paying, about my dad's financial circumstances. When I mentioned that my dad had said this was normal because even Grandpa Robert made all his kids pay rent when they turned 18, Sarah got very quiet. Then she asked me a question that stopped me cold. "Jake, do you know who owns your dad's house?" I assumed he did, obviously. He'd been making mortgage payments for years, talking about property taxes, doing maintenance and improvements like any homeowner would. But Sarah shook her head. "Your grandfather owns that house," she said. "He owns all of our houses. He bought them for us when we got married so none of his kids would have to worry about housing costs." The room started spinning. I asked her what she meant, and Sarah explained that our grandfather, Robert, who I'd always known was wealthy from his successful construction business, had purchased homes for each of his 4 children when they started their families. The houses remained in his name, but his kids lived in them rent-free as long as they were responsible and contributing members of society. Not only did my dad not own the house I'd been paying rent on, but he'd never paid a mortgage, never paid property taxes, never paid for any major repairs or maintenance. Grandpa Robert covered all of that, but it got worse. Sarah told me that Robert had also been quietly supplementing my dad's income for years, helping with utilities, groceries, car payments, medical expenses. My dad's comfortable middle-class lifestyle wasn't funded by his job as a mid-level manager at a logistics company. It was funded by his father's generosity. I felt sick. I'd been paying rent to live in a house my dad didn't own, while he collected money from me and from his father simultaneously. I'd been working myself to exhaustion to contribute to a household that was already being subsidized by family wealth I never knew existed. The next morning, I called Grandpa Robert. I'd always had a good relationship with him, but we usually only talked at family gatherings or holidays. This time, I needed answers. Grandpa Robert was in his 70s, but still sharp as a tack. When I explained what had been happening, the silence on the other end of the phone was terrifying. Finally, he asked me to repeat everything I'd told him, slowly, and to give him exact dates and dollar amounts. After I finished talking, Grandpa Robert was quiet for a long moment. Then, he said something I'll never forget. "Jake, your father lied to you about everything. He lied about the rent, he lied about the house, and he lied about me. I need to have a conversation with him immediately." That afternoon, Grandpa Robert drove to my dad's house. I wasn't there, obviously, since I'd moved out. But Sarah filled me in on what happened afterward. According to her, Robert was furious in a way the family had never seen before. Apparently, the conversation between Robert and my dad was explosive. Robert confronted him about charging me rent while living in a house Robert owned, and while receiving financial assistance Robert provided. He was appalled that David had kicked me out to make room for his new family, while continuing to accept help that was originally intended to support me as well. But the worst part was discovering that David had been lying to Jennifer too. She had no idea that their comfortable lifestyle was funded by Robert's generosity. David had presented himself as financially successful and independent, capable of supporting a family on his own income. Jennifer married him thinking he was self-sufficient, not knowing she was actually being supported by her husband's father. 2 days after Robert's visit, I got a call from my dad. He was crying, which I'd only seen him do at my mother's funeral. He begged me to come home. Said there had been a misunderstanding. Said we could work everything out as a family. When I pressed him for details, the truth came pouring out. Robert had given David an ultimatum: either make things right with me immediately, or lose all financial support permanently. No more free housing. No more supplemental income. No more safety net. David was panicking because without Robert's help, he couldn't afford to support Jennifer and her daughter and the new baby. His actual salary was less than half of what his lifestyle required. He'd been living a complete lie for years, and now it was all crashing down around him. But Robert had also made me an offer. Instead of returning to that toxic situation, I could accept a full scholarship arrangement. Robert would pay for my remaining college expenses, set me up in my own apartment, and provide a reasonable living allowance until I graduated and found full-time employment. The only condition was that I focus on my studies and maintain good grades. The choice was obvious, but it still felt surreal. I could go back to my father's house, where I'd be welcomed only because my presence meant continued financial support from Robert, or I could accept my grandfather's generosity directly and build an independent life. I chose independence, and it was the best decision I've ever made. Robert helped me find a small one-bedroom apartment near campus, covered my tuition and books, and provided enough monthly support that I could quit my second job and focus on school. For the first time in months, I was sleeping properly and my grades improved dramatically. Meanwhile, David's life completely fell apart. Without Robert's financial support, he couldn't maintain the lifestyle Jennifer had grown accustomed to. She discovered that their house, their cars, even their furniture, had been purchased with Robert's money. The successful, independent man she'd married was actually dependent on his father for everything. Jennifer filed for divorce within 3 months. She moved out and took her daughter with her, leaving David alone in a house he didn't own, with a mountain of expenses he couldn't afford. The baby, my half-sister, became part of a custody arrangement that David could barely manage financially. David started calling me constantly, begging me to reconcile with Robert so the family support would resume. He apologized for lying to me, for charging me rent, for kicking me out. But it was clear his primary concern was getting back in Robert's good graces rather than repairing our relationship. I realized that my father had never seen me as his son first and a financial burden second. To him, I was always just another expense to be managed, another mouth to feed, another person taking resources away from what he really wanted. When Jennifer and her family became his priority, I became expendable. The saddest part is that I don't think David ever understood what he'd lost. He was so focused on maintaining his image and his lifestyle that he destroyed his relationship with his father and his son. He chose financial comfort over family loyalty, and when the money disappeared, he had nothing left. I'm graduating in 6 months with a degree in engineering, a solid GPA, and job prospects that will let me support myself without anyone's help. I have a relationship with my grandfather based on mutual respect rather than dependency, and I've learned to value authenticity over convenience. David still calls sometimes, usually when he's having financial problems or when something reminds him that he's lost his son. I listen politely, but I don't visit and I don't offer help. He made his choice when he decided I was less important than his new family's comfort. I've learned that blood doesn't guarantee loyalty, and that sometimes the people who claim to love us are really just using us for their own purposes. Robert showed me what genuine family support looks like, and I'll never settle for less again. Sometimes it takes losing everything to reveal who people really are underneath. I'm 29 years old, and 3 days ago I completely destroyed my relationship with my father in front of our entire extended family. I'm still processing whether I feel guilty about it or if it was the most liberating moment of my life. But I needed to get this out somewhere because I can't stop replaying it in my head. Some background first. My childhood was a nightmare, and my father Robert was the world's most accomplished bystander to my suffering. My mother was a textbook narcissist with violent tendencies, and my father's response to her abuse was to become completely invisible. She would scream at me for hours over trivial things, throw dishes when she was angry, hit me with whatever was within reach, and my father would literally leave the room or find urgent errands to run. I have vivid memories of cowering in corners while my mother raged about my grades, my friends, my appearance, anything that triggered her need to tear someone down. And I have equally vivid memories of my father walking past those scenes like they weren't happening. Like his 8-year-old son wasn't being psychologically destroyed in the next room. The worst part wasn't even the abuse itself. Kids are resilient, and I might have been able to process having one unstable parent. The worst part was realizing that my father, the person who was supposed to protect me, had chosen his own comfort over my safety. Every time he walked away instead of intervening, every time he made excuses for her behavior, every time he told me to just ignore her when she gets like this, he was teaching me that I wasn't worth defending. When I turned 18, I joined the Air Force partly to serve my country, but mostly to get as far away from that house as possible. Military life suited me because the structure and clear expectations were the opposite of the chaos I'd grown up with. I served 4 years, did 2 deployments, and learned what it felt like to be around people who had each other's backs. During my service, I had minimal contact with my parents. I'd call on holidays, send the obligatory cards, but I kept my distance emotionally. My mother would still try to push my buttons during phone conversations, criticizing my career choice, my friends, my decision to stay single. But at least I could hang up when it got too bad. 3 years ago, my mother was killed in a drunk driving accident. She was the drunk driver, and thankfully she didn't take anyone else with her. But the irony wasn't lost on me that she'd managed to make even her own death about destruction and chaos. I felt relief more than grief. which probably makes me sound horrible. But it was the first time in my adult life I could breathe without waiting for the other shoe to drop. I thought my father and I might be able to rebuild some kind of relationship after she died. With the primary source of toxicity gone, maybe we could address what had happened and figure out how to move forward. I was wrong. Robert seemed to view her death as vindication of his approach. He'd stayed married to her until the end. He'd never fought back. He'd endured her abuse with what he saw as dignity and patience. In his mind, he'd been the long-suffering saint married to a difficult woman. And now that she was gone, he expected credit for his forbearance. We never talked about my childhood. Not once, when I tried to bring up specific incidents, times when I'd needed him to protect me and he'd failed. He'd change the subject or say something about how your mother had her struggles, but we all did our best. He genuinely seemed to believe that his passivity had been noble rather than destructive. I'd been out of the military for 2 years and working as a logistics coordinator when my Aunt Sandra invited me to the annual family reunion. I usually avoided these gatherings because they reminded me of all the times relatives had witnessed my mother's behavior and done nothing, but Sandra was persistent. She said it would be good for me to reconnect with the family, and honestly, I thought maybe she was right. The reunion was being held at my Uncle Mike's house, and there were probably 30 people there from my dad's side of the family. Cousins I hadn't seen in years, great aunts who remembered me as a kid, the whole extended family network that I distanced myself from during my military years. I was actually having an okay time at first. My cousin Jake and I had been catching up about his job, and a few relatives had thanked me for my service, which always feels awkward but well-intentioned. I was starting to think maybe Sandra had been right about reconnecting. Then I overheard the conversation that changed everything. My father was standing near the back porch with my Uncle Mike and a guy I didn't recognize, apparently a coworker of Mike's. They were talking about marriage troubles, specifically about Mike's coworker going through a rough patch because he'd discovered his wife was having an affair. The coworker was asking for advice, talking about how betrayed he felt, how he didn't know whether to try to work things out or file for divorce. He was clearly struggling with the decision and looking for guidance from older men who'd been married longer. That's when my father spoke up. He started talking about the importance of forgiveness, about how marriage requires sacrifice and patience, about how children need to see their parents working through difficulties, rather than giving up when things get tough. He said that a real man doesn't abandon his family just because his wife makes mistakes, that staying together through adversity sets a positive example for the next generation. Then he said the words that made my vision go red. I stayed with my wife through all her problems, and I think I set a great example for my son about what commitment looks like. Sometimes you have to take the high road even when it's difficult. I couldn't breathe. This man, who had spent my entire childhood watching his wife psychologically torture their child, was presenting his cowardice as virtue. He was telling another man to endure infidelity because he believed his own failure to protect me had been admirable. The worst part was that he genuinely seemed to believe it. In his mind, staying married to an abuser while allowing that abuse to continue made him a hero. He'd rewritten our entire family history to cast himself as the noble martyr rather than the enabler who'd chosen the easy path every single time. I walked over to their conversation without really deciding to do it. My father saw me coming and smiled, probably expecting me to join their discussion about the importance of family commitment. Instead, I asked him if he was seriously giving marriage advice based on his own experience. He looked confused and said that yes, he thought his perspective might be helpful since he'd stayed married for over 20 years despite facing challenges. The coworker was nodding along, clearly impressed by my father's apparent dedication to his family. That's when I lost it completely. I told the coworker that my father's idea of taking the high road had involved watching his wife abuse their child for years without ever intervening. I said that his commitment to his marriage had required sacrificing his son's safety and mental health, and that if that was the kind of example he wanted to set for his own kids, he should definitely follow my father's advice. The conversation stopped dead. My father went pale and started stammering about how I was mischaracterizing things, how every family has difficulties, how I was being unfair. but I couldn't stop talking. I told him that he was pathetic, that he'd spent my entire childhood choosing his own comfort over his child's well-being, that his family knew he was a coward who'd rather enable abuse than face conflict. I said that no one would ever see him as an example to live by because he'd proven that he cared more about avoiding confrontation than protecting the people who depended on him. By this point, half the reunion had gathered around us. My voice was carrying, and people were staring at this scene unfolding on what was supposed to be a pleasant family afternoon. My father looked humiliated. My Uncle Mike was trying to defuse the situation, and the coworker was backing away like he'd stumbled into a private family crisis. But I wasn't done. I told my father that his wife would rather have spent her last years drinking herself to death than dealing with the reality of being married to someone so weak, and that he should never, ever believe that anyone respected his approach to anything. The silence afterward was deafening. My father was staring at me like he'd never seen me before, and I realized that maybe he hadn't. Maybe he'd spent so many years avoiding difficult truths that he genuinely didn't understand the damage his passivity had caused. My Uncle Mike asked me to step outside with him, and several relatives followed us, creating these awkward small groups of people trying to process what had just happened. Some of my cousins came over to tell me they thought it was about time someone called Robert out on his behavior. They'd witnessed some of my mother's outbursts over the years and had always wondered why my father never stepped in. But other relatives were horrified. My great-aunt Helen told me I should be ashamed of myself for embarrassing my father in public, that family problems should be handled privately, that I was being cruel to a man who'd already lost his wife. She said I was destroying family relationships over old grievances that should have been forgiven years ago. The family was completely divided. Some people thought my father had needed to hear those words for decades, while others thought I'd crossed a line by airing our family's dysfunction in front of everyone. Both sides had valid points, but I realized I didn't care about their opinions anymore. My father didn't try to defend himself or argue with what I'd said. He just stood there looking defeated, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for him. But then I remembered all the times I'd looked at him the same way as a kid, hoping he'd finally stand up for me, and the sympathy evaporated. I left the reunion about an hour later. Several relatives hugged me goodbye and told me they supported what I'd done, while others wouldn't make eye contact. My father and I didn't speak before I left. 2 days later, my grandmother called me. She's my father's mother, and I expected her to be angry about the public confrontation. Instead, she told me that she and my grandfather had been talking to Robert about what I'd said, and they'd realized they might have failed him as parents by not teaching him to stand up for what was right. She said they'd given him an ultimatum. Either he goes to therapy to address his passive behavior and makes a genuine effort to understand the damage he'd caused, or they'd be limiting their relationship with him going forward. They were in their 80s and didn't want to spend their remaining years pretending that his approach to parenting had been acceptable. I was shocked. I'd expected the older generation to side with family unity over confronting difficult truths, but apparently my outburst had forced everyone to acknowledge things they'd been ignoring for years. My father hasn't contacted me since the reunion, and I'm okay with that. I spent years trying to get him to acknowledge his failures, hoping he'd eventually take responsibility for the choices he'd made during my childhood. The reunion showed me that he'll never see his passivity as anything other than virtue, and I'm finally at peace with that reality. I don't regret what I said, even though it probably destroyed any chance we had of rebuilding our relationship. Sometimes the truth is more important than keeping the peace. And sometimes, speaking up for your younger self is worth sacrificing your adult relationships. The ripple effects of family trauma can last generations, affecting relationships we never expected. I'm 35 years old, a single mom to the most amazing 13-year-old boy, and I'm struggling with a situation that has completely torn apart our family. I keep going back and forth on whether I handled this right. But watching my son's heart break in real time was one of the most painful experiences I've ever had as a parent. Some background first. My ex-husband left when Leo was 7, and since then, it's been just the two of us against the world. My brother Jack stepped up in a huge way during that difficult time, becoming the male role model Leo desperately needed. Jack would take Leo to baseball games, teach him to throw a football, include him in guys' weekends with his friends. Leo absolutely worshipped his uncle, and honestly, Jack seemed to love the role. When Jack started dating Mary 3 years ago, Leo was initially hesitant about sharing his uncle's attention, but he warmed up to her pretty quickly. Mary was good with kids, seemed to enjoy Leo's company, and I was relieved that Jack had found someone who understood how important his relationship with my son was to our family dynamic. Last year, Jack proposed to Mary, and Leo was over the moon. He immediately started talking about the wedding, asking if he could be in the wedding party, wondering what he should wear, planning how he'd help with setup and cleanup. Jack promised him a special role in the ceremony and assured him that he'd be integral to their big day. The engagement period was wonderful for Leo. He felt so grown up being included in wedding discussions, and Jack and Mary would ask his opinion on everything from flowers to music to venue decorations. Leo spent hours researching wedding traditions and customs because he wanted to be helpful and knowledgeable. He was taking his role as the groom's nephew very seriously. 6 months ago, Jack and Mary announced they'd decided on a destination wedding in Mexico. They'd found this beautiful resort that offered wedding packages, and they were excited about having their celebration somewhere tropical and romantic. Leo was thrilled about his first international trip and immediately started asking me about getting a passport. The invitation arrived 4 months before the wedding date, addressed to both Leo and me. It was gorgeous, printed on thick cardstock with gold foil details, and Leo kept it on his desk where he could look at it every day. He'd already started saving his allowance money to buy Jack and Mary a special wedding gift, and he'd been researching Mexican customs so he could incorporate something meaningful into whatever role he'd play in the ceremony. Everything seemed perfect until 3 weeks before the wedding, when I decided to book our hotel rooms at the resort. I'd been putting it off because money was tight, and I was hoping to get a better deal closer to the date. But I realized I couldn't wait any longer. When I called the resort to make our reservation, the booking agent asked how many adults would be staying in the rooms. I said 1 adult and 1 child, and that's when she informed me that children under 16 weren't permitted at the resort at all. I thought there had to be some mistake. I explained that we were attending a wedding, that my 13-year-old son was part of the wedding party, that we'd received an official invitation months ago. The agent was apologetic but firm. The resort had a strict adults-only policy, and there were no exceptions, even for wedding guests. My heart sank into my stomach. I asked to speak to a manager, thinking maybe there was some kind of waiver or special arrangement for wedding parties. The manager confirmed what the agent had told me. No one under 16 was allowed on the property, not for weddings, not for any reason. I immediately called Mary, thinking she'd be as shocked as I was, and we could figure out a solution together. When I explained what the booking agent had told me, there was a long pause on the other end of the phone. Finally, Mary said quietly, "Oh, I was hoping that wouldn't come up until closer to the date." The way she said it made my blood run cold. I asked her what she meant, and she admitted that she'd known about the age restriction from the beginning. She'd chosen the resort specifically because it was adults only, thinking it would create a more sophisticated atmosphere for their celebration. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I asked her why she hadn't mentioned this when they sent Leo an invitation, why she'd let him spend months planning and saving and getting excited about a wedding he couldn't attend. Mary got defensive and said she'd been hoping we could find a workaround, maybe have Leo stay at a different hotel nearby and just come for the ceremony itself. When I explained that even that wouldn't work because the entire resort was off limits to children, she suggested that maybe this was a sign that Leo was getting too old to need constant supervision anyway, and it might be good for him to spend a week with his grandparents while we celebrated. I was speechless. This woman had watched my son spend months being excited about their wedding, had accepted his help with planning, had let him believe he was an important part of their special day, all while knowing he wouldn't be able to attend. The conversation with Leo was devastating. I sat him down that evening and tried to explain as gently as possible that there had been a mistake with the wedding planning, that the resort didn't allow children, and that he wouldn't be able to come to Uncle Jack's wedding after all. Leo's face crumpled immediately. He asked if we could find a different hotel, if we could talk to the resort manager, if there was any way to make it work. When I explained that the entire property was adults only, he started crying and asked why Uncle Jack had invited him if he couldn't come. That's when I had to tell him that Jack and Mary had known about the restriction all along. Watching the realization hit him was like watching someone's innocence die in real time. The confusion in his eyes, the way his face changed from hope to hurt to betrayal. It's an image I'll never get out of my head. Leo asked if he could call Uncle Jack to talk about it, still believing that there had to be some misunderstanding. I let him make the call, hoping against hope that Jack would have some kind of solution, or at least an explanation that would soften the blow. Jack sounded uncomfortable and kept apologizing, saying he'd wanted to tell Leo earlier but hadn't known how. Leo, through his tears, asked if they could change the venue to somewhere he could attend. He offered to give them all his savings, about $300 he'd been carefully accumulating, to help pay for the change. That's when Mary, who was apparently listening on speakerphone, lost her patience completely. She told Leo that he was being selfish, that this was their wedding day and not everything was about him, that he needed to grow up and understand that adults sometimes had celebrations that didn't include children. The cruelty in her voice was stunning. This was a 13-year-old boy who had idolized her and her fiancé, who had been nothing but supportive and excited about their relationship, and she was telling him he was selfish for being heartbroken about being excluded from the most important day in his uncle's life. Leo hung up the phone and went to his room. For the next 3 days, he barely spoke. When Jack called to try to smooth things over, Leo refused to come to the phone. When Jack showed up at our house with apologies and promises of a special trip after they got back from their honeymoon, Leo wouldn't come out of his room. The change in my son was immediate and heartbreaking. This kid who had been so excited about growing up, about being included in adult celebrations, about having a close relationship with his uncle, suddenly seemed to lose faith in all of it. He stopped talking about the wedding entirely, stopped asking about Jack, stopped showing interest in the family gatherings where he might see his uncle. Watching a child's trust get shattered like that is heartbreaking. Kids don't forget when the adults they look up to show them they're not really valued. Sometimes protecting a child's boundaries is more important than keeping the peace. Jack and Mary got married as planned. I saw the photos on social media. Beautiful shots of them on the beach, surrounded by adult family members and friends. Leo didn't ask to see the pictures, and I didn't show them to him. When they returned from their honeymoon, Jack started reaching out constantly. He wanted to take Leo on that special trip he'd promised, wanted to have dinner together, wanted to rebuild their relationship. Leo declined everything politely but firmly. The family pressure started almost immediately. My parents thought I should encourage Leo to forgive Jack, that holding a grudge wasn't healthy for a 13-year-old. Jack's parents called me to say that Leo was breaking Jack's heart, that family was more important than wedding disagreements. Everyone seemed to think this was about me being bitter that my son wasn't included, but they were missing the point entirely. Leo wasn't angry about missing a party. He was devastated that 2 adults he trusted had deliberately deceived him for months, had let him invest emotionally in something they knew he couldn't be part of. I made the decision to support Leo's boundaries completely. When family members suggested he was being immature or holding a grudge, I explained that he was processing a legitimate betrayal and needed time to heal. When Jack asked me to force Leo to spend time with him, I told him that trust had to be rebuilt slowly and that Leo would decide when and if he was ready for that. Some family members understood and supported our decision. Others thought I was enabling Leo's resentment and preventing him from learning important lessons about forgiveness. The family gatherings became tense, with people taking sides and Leo feeling the pressure of everyone's expectations. But Leo remained firm in his decision. He was polite when he encountered Jack at family events, but he didn't seek out conversation or connection. When his birthday came around and Jack wanted to plan something special, Leo asked me to tell him that a card would be sufficient. It's been 8 months since the wedding that didn't include my son. Leo has started to seem more like himself again, but something fundamental has changed in how he approaches relationships with adults. He's more cautious about trusting people's promises, more protective of his emotional investments. Jack still reaches out periodically, still hopes that time will heal the rift he created. But Leo has learned a painful lesson about how adults can prioritize their own desires over a child's feelings, and he's not ready to forget that lesson yet. I don't know if their relationship will ever recover, and honestly, I'm not sure it should, unless Jack truly understands what he did wrong. Leo deserves adults in his life who see him as valuable for his own sake, not as an afterthought to be managed when convenient. Trust, once broken, can reveal disturbing truths that were hidden in plain sight. I'm 29 years old, married to my husband Tom for 6 years, and 3 weeks ago I discovered that the man I trusted with my life and the lives of our 2 daughters had been systematically endangering them for months. I'm still trying to process the level of betrayal involved, and I need to get this out because I feel like I'm losing my mind. Tom and I have what I always thought was a solid marriage. We met in college, dated for 4 years before getting engaged, and have 2 beautiful daughters together. Emma is 5 and Sophie is 3, and they're the center of our world. Tom works as an accountant at a mid-sized firm downtown, and I work part-time as a nurse practitioner at a family clinic, which gives me flexibility to be home with the girls in the afternoons. About 2 months ago, I started noticing small changes in Tom's behavior that didn't quite make sense. He'd started working late more often, claiming his firm was going through busy season even though it wasn't tax time. He'd get phone calls that he'd step outside to take, saying it was work stuff that was confidential. He'd shower as soon as he got home from these late nights, which was unusual since he normally waited until bedtime. The first concrete sign that something was wrong came when I was cleaning out his car to install Sophie's new car seat. Wedged between the passenger seat cushions, I found a tampon that definitely wasn't mine. I've had an IUD for 2 years that stopped my periods completely. And even when I did get them, I used a completely different brand than what I'd found. I stared at that tampon for probably 5 minutes, trying to come up with innocent explanations. Maybe one of his female coworkers had needed a ride somewhere and it had fallen out of her purse. Maybe it had been there since before we bought the car, though we'd owned it for 3 years. Maybe I was overthinking a complete non-issue, but something about finding it felt wrong. The way it was tucked deep between the cushions, like someone had been sitting there regularly, and it had worked its way down over time. The fact that Tom had never mentioned giving anyone rides to work or helping out coworkers with transportation. A week later, I found another one in our bedroom, in my sock drawer of all places. This one, I couldn't explain away. There was no innocent reason for a tampon I'd never purchased to end up in my personal belongings. Someone else had been in our bedroom. Someone who felt comfortable enough to open my dresser drawers and leave traces of her presence. I started paying closer attention to Tom's schedule and behavior. The late nights were happening 2 or 3 times a week, always on days when I worked late at the clinic and wouldn't be home until after 7. He'd come home around 8:30 or 9, claiming he'd grab dinner near the office, but he never seemed particularly full or satisfied, like someone who'd just eaten. I began checking his phone when he was in the shower, but there was nothing suspicious in his texts or call history. Whoever he was communicating with, he was being careful about covering his tracks. I felt guilty for snooping, but I also felt like I was going crazy trying to figure out what was happening in my own home. 2 weeks ago, I came home from work to find Sophie wearing an outfit I'd never seen before. It was a cute little sundress with matching hair clips. Definitely something I would have remembered buying, but I had no memory of purchasing it. When I asked Tom where it had come from, he looked genuinely confused and said he'd assumed I'd bought it. I pressed him for details about Sophie's day, asking if they'd gone shopping or if anyone had come over to visit. Tom insisted they'd stayed home all day, that Sophie had probably just found the dress in her closet and he'd helped her put it on. But I organized my daughter's clothes obsessively, and I knew for certain that dress hadn't been in there the night before. That night, after Tom fell asleep, I went through both girls' rooms thoroughly. I found 3 other items of clothing I'd never purchased: a pair of pajamas for Emma, a little cardigan for Sophie, and a set of hair accessories that were definitely not from any store I shopped at. Someone had been buying clothes for my children, and either Tom was lying about not knowing where they came from, or someone else had access to our house that I wasn't aware of. I started taking pictures of everything the girls wore each morning before I left for work, documenting their outfits so I'd know if anything changed during the day. For 3 days, everything remained the same. On the 4th day, I came home to find Emma wearing completely different clothes than what I'd dressed her in that morning. When I confronted Tom about it, he became defensive in a way I'd never seen before. He said I was being paranoid, that maybe I'd forgotten what I'd dressed Emma in, that the girls were old enough to change their own clothes if they spilled something or got dirty playing. But Emma was 5, and while she could dress herself, she'd never shown interest in choosing elaborate outfits or coordinating accessories. I asked Tom directly if anyone had been to our house during the day, if any of his family members or co-workers had stopped by, if there was any explanation for these changes that he could think of. He swore that no one had been over, that it had just been him and the girls all day, and that I was making a big deal out of nothing. That's when I made the decision to install a hidden camera system. I felt horrible about spying on my own husband, but I needed to know what was happening in my house when I wasn't there. I ordered a discreet indoor camera and set it up in our living room while Tom was at work, positioning it so it would capture anyone coming and going through our front door. For 2 days, the camera showed nothing unusual. Tom and the girls had normal days at home, playing in the living room, watching cartoons, eating lunch together. I started wondering if I really was being paranoid, if I'd somehow created a conspiracy in my mind out of innocent coincidences. On the 3rd day, the camera captured something that made my blood run cold. At around 11 in the morning, Tom opened the front door and led a woman into our house. She had dark hair, was probably in her late 20s, and was carrying what looked like shopping bags. The girls ran to her immediately, hugging her legs like they knew her well, like she'd been coming to our house regularly. I watched in horror as this stranger played with my daughters, helped them try on new clothes from the bags she'd brought, and acted completely comfortable in my home. Tom was relaxed and friendly with her, not like someone who was having an affair, but like someone spending time with a close family member. The most disturbing part was how familiar the girls were with her. They called her by name, showed her their toys, climbed into her lap for stories. This wasn't someone they'd just met. This was someone who'd been spending significant time with my children, someone they'd grown attached to, someone I'd never heard of or seen before in my life. I fast-forwarded through the rest of the recording and watched this woman stay in our house for nearly 6 hours. She made lunch for the girls, helped them with art projects, even put Sophie down for her nap. Around 4:30, just before I normally got home from work, she packed up her things and left through our back door. Tom had been lying to me for months about who was caring for our children while I was at work. Instead of the stay-at-home dad situation I thought we had, he'd been bringing a complete stranger into our house to spend time with Emma and Sophie without my knowledge or consent. I confronted Tom that night with screenshots from the camera, demanding to know who this woman was and why he'd been lying to me about her presence in our home. The look on his face when he saw the images told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a misunderstanding or an innocent explanation I'd somehow missed. This was a deliberate deception he'd been maintaining for months. Finally, Tom broke down and told me the truth. The woman was his sister Rachel, who I'd never met because she'd been living in another state for the past several years. Rachel had been staying with us periodically, helping Tom take care of the girls while I was at work, and he'd kept it secret because he knew I wouldn't approve. I asked him why I wouldn't approve of help from his sister, and that's when he dropped the bomb that destroyed our marriage. Rachel was a registered sex offender. She'd been convicted of child sexual abuse 3 years earlier and was supposed to be living under court supervision 2 states away. She'd been violating the terms of her probation by coming to our house, and Tom had been facilitating it. The room started spinning. I asked Tom how he could possibly think it was acceptable to allow a convicted child abuser to spend unsupervised time with our daughters. He started talking about redemption and second chances, about how Rachel had been through therapy and was a different person now, about how she'd helped him realize that people could change and deserved forgiveness. I didn't wait to hear the rest of his justification. I packed bags for myself and the girls that night and left to stay with my sister. The next morning, I filed for divorce and requested emergency custody, providing the court with the camera footage and documentation of Rachel's criminal history. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of Tom's deception. Rachel had been staying in our house regularly for over 4 months, sometimes overnight when I worked late shifts at the clinic. She'd been sleeping in our bed, going through our personal belongings, and spending extensive, unsupervised time with Emma and Sophie. Tom had been prioritizing his sister's desire for family connection over our daughter's safety, exposing them to someone who'd already demonstrated a willingness to sexually abuse children. He'd lied to me, to the courts, and most importantly, he'd put Emma and Sophie at risk to protect Rachel's feelings. The divorce was finalized 6 weeks later, with me receiving full custody and Tom getting supervised visitation rights. Rachel was arrested for violating her probation and is currently serving time for the original charges, plus the additional violations. Tom still maintains that he was trying to help his sister rebuild her life, that Rachel never showed any inappropriate behavior toward Emma and Sophie, that I'm overreacting to a situation I don't fully understand. But he can't explain why he felt the need to lie about her presence for months, why he hid her criminal history from me, or why he thought supervised visitation restrictions existed for people like Rachel if they weren't necessary. The hardest part has been helping Emma and Sophie understand why they can't see Aunt Rachel anymore, why Daddy doesn't live with us, why their entire world changed so suddenly. They'd grown attached to Rachel, who had apparently been kind and attentive during her visits. And they missed the woman who played games with them and brought them presents. I'll never forgive Tom for putting our daughters at risk to satisfy his own need to believe in his sister's redemption. Some people don't deserve second chances, especially not second chances that involve access to vulnerable children. Tom's misplaced loyalty could have cost Emma and Sophie their innocence, or worse, and I'll spend the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I hadn't discovered his deception when I did. Sometimes the people we trust most are hiding the darkest secrets. I'm 45 years old, and 6 months ago I had to come to terms with one of the most painful realizations of my life. The daughter I raised for 12 years, the little girl I thought I'd lost to divorce and wealth, came back to me as a complete stranger who saw me as nothing more than a potential ATM. I'm still processing the cruelty of it all, and I needed to share this somewhere because the people in my life are tired of hearing me try to make sense of what happened. Let me start with some background. My ex-wife Carmen and I divorced when our daughter Aria was 10 years old. The marriage had been falling apart for years, mainly because Carmen had developed expensive tastes that my construction worker's salary couldn't support. She wanted the designer clothes, the luxury vacations, the fancy restaurants, and I was working 60-hour weeks just to keep us in our modest 3-bedroom house. When Carmen met Richard, a successful real estate developer with inherited wealth, she didn't waste time pretending our marriage could be saved. She moved out within a month of meeting him, taking Aria with her to his mansion across town. I was devastated but tried to stay focused on maintaining a relationship with my daughter through the custody arrangement. The first year after the divorce, Aria seemed to adjust well to splitting time between 2 very different households. She'd spend weekends with me, and we'd do simple things like going to the park, making pancakes for breakfast, working on craft projects together. She never complained about the difference between Richard's house and mine, never made me feel like I wasn't enough. But gradually, I started noticing changes in her attitude. She'd mentioned the exotic vacations Carmen and Richard were taking, the private school they'd enrolled her in, the horse riding lessons Richard was paying for. She wasn't bragging exactly, but there was a new awareness in her voice about the lifestyle gap between her 2 homes. By the time Aria turned 12, our weekend visits had become strained. She'd show up with expensive clothes and gadgets, talking about friends whose parents were doctors and lawyers and business owners. She'd make polite conversation during our time together, but I could tell she was mentally somewhere else, probably wishing she was at one of the elaborate parties or activities that had become normal in her new social circle. The conversation that changed everything happened on a rainy Saturday in November. Aria had been unusually quiet during lunch, picking at the grilled cheese sandwich I'd made instead of eating it. Finally, She looked up at me and asked if we could talk about something important. She told me that Richard wanted to adopt her officially, but that couldn't happen unless I signed away my parental rights. She explained it like she was discussing weekend plans, matter of fact and casual, like she didn't understand the magnitude of what she was asking. I tried to explain to her what signing away parental rights would mean, that I wouldn't legally be her father anymore, that she'd have no inheritance rights from me, that Richard would become her father in every legal sense. She nodded along like she understood, but then she said something that broke my heart. She said she thought it would be better for everyone if Richard adopted her, because then she wouldn't have to split her time between two different worlds anymore. She could focus on her new life, her new school, her new opportunities, without having to worry about disappointing me by not being excited about our simple weekend activities. The worst part was that she wasn't being cruel or manipulative. She was 12 years old, making what seemed like a logical decision to her young mind. But hearing my daughter essentially say that I was holding her back from the life she really wanted was devastating. I spent 2 weeks agonizing over the decision before finally meeting with a lawyer. He explained that fighting the adoption would be expensive and potentially traumatic for Aria, especially since she'd expressed a clear preference for living with Richard full-time. In the end, I signed the papers because I thought I was doing what was best for my daughter's happiness. That was 10 years ago, and until 6 months ago, I hadn't seen or heard from Aria since the adoption was finalized. I remarried 3 years after the divorce to a wonderful woman named Beth, who brought her own 8-year-old son into our relationship. Beth and I have since had a daughter together, and our blended family has been the source of all my happiness for the past several years. I built a good life after losing Aria. I started my own contracting business, bought a larger house for our growing family, coached Little League for my stepson Jake, and threw myself into being the kind of father and husband I wished I'd been able to be the first time around. I thought about Aria often, wondered how she was doing, but I respected the choice she'd made and tried not to dwell on what I'd lost. Then, 6 months ago, she showed up at my door. I almost didn't recognize her at first. She was 22, tall and thin, with expensive-looking clothes that had seen better days. Her hair was perfectly styled, but she looked exhausted, like she hadn't been sleeping well. When she said my name, I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. She asked if we could talk, and I invited her inside, my heart racing with hope and confusion, and a dozen other emotions I couldn't identify. Beth was at work and the kids were at school, so we had the house to ourselves to figure out what this unexpected reunion meant. Aria sat on my couch and told me that Carmen had died 3 months earlier from cancer. I was shocked because I'd had no idea she was sick, but Aria explained that Carmen had kept her illness private until the very end. She said the funeral had been small, just family and close friends, and she hadn't thought to contact me because we weren't legally related anymore. Then she told me that Richard had been struggling with Carmen's death and had decided he needed space to grieve. He'd asked her to move out of the family home and get her own place, saying it was time for her to start living independently as a young adult. The problem was that Aria had never held a real job, never learned to manage money, never developed any practical life skills. She'd gone straight from high school to a liberal arts college that Richard had paid for, where she'd studied art history and philosophy without ever thinking about career prospects. After graduation, she'd moved back home and spent 2 years basically being a wealthy man's adult daughter with no responsibilities. She was asking if she could stay with me temporarily while she figured out her next steps. She said she'd been thinking about our relationship over the years, wondering if she'd made a mistake by cutting me out of her life, hoping that maybe we could reconnect and build something new together. I wanted so badly to believe that she'd realized what she'd lost when she chose Richard over me. I wanted to think that she'd grown up and understood the value of authentic family relationships over financial comfort. But something about the way she was talking made me suspicious. I asked her directly what she was hoping to get out of reconnecting with me. She talked about family bonds and forgiveness and second chances, but when I pressed her for specifics about her long-term plans, she became evasive. Finally, I asked her the question that revealed everything. I said that if we were going to rebuild our relationship, She needed to understand that I had new responsibilities now. Beth and the kids were my priority. And while I'd always love Arya, I couldn't support her financially or change my will to include her in my inheritance. The change in her expression was immediate and devastating. The fake warmth disappeared, replaced by cold calculation. She asked me how much money I had, what my house was worth, whether I'd built up any significant assets since she'd seen me last. When I explained that most of my wealth was tied up in the business and the house, and that I'd already established college funds and inheritance plans for Jake and my younger daughter, Arya became openly hostile. She said she couldn't believe I'd replaced her so easily, that I'd given up on my real daughter to play house with someone else's family. I tried to explain that she was the one who'd asked me to sign away my parental rights, that she'd chosen Richard as her father and his wealth as her security. But she acted like none of that mattered now, like I was supposed to drop everything and restore her to her original place in my life, regardless of the choices she'd made. She left that day angry and empty-handed, and I thought that would be the end of it. I was heartbroken but also relieved that I'd seen her true motivations before making any commitments I couldn't keep. 3 months later, she came back. This time she looked desperate, almost frantic. Her clothes were dirty, her hair was unwashed, and she had what looked like bruises on her arms. She begged me to let her stay with me, said she had nowhere else to go, that she'd been staying with friends but had run out of options. I asked her what had happened, and she told me she'd gotten involved with some people who loaned money at high interest rates. She owed several $1,000s and was being threatened with violence if she didn't pay. She needed help, and she'd finally realized that I was the only family she had left. My heart broke for her, but I also knew this was exactly the kind of situation that would never end. If I bailed her out once, she'd be back whenever the next crisis hit. And there would always be another crisis, because she'd never learned to take care of herself. I offered to help her find a job, to connect her with social services, to support her in practical ways that would help her build independence. But when she realized I wasn't going to write her a check or let her move into my house with my other children, she turned vicious. She called Beth my replacement wife and referred to Jake and my daughter as your fake kids. She said I was pathetic for pretending that a constructed family could ever mean as much as my real daughter, and that she hoped I was happy with the bargain I'd made when I traded her for a new set of children who were easier to manage. That's when I finally understood that the little girl I'd loved and lost was truly gone. This woman who looked like Arya but had none of her sweetness, none of her curiosity, none of the qualities that had made her special, was all that remained of my daughter. I told her to leave and not come back. She screamed at me about abandonment and betrayal, but I closed the door and didn't respond. 2 weeks later, my mother called to tell me that Arya had contacted her asking for money, spinning some story about me being cruel and refusing to help his own child. I explained the real situation to my mother, and she was horrified. She'd been prepared to send Arya money based on her sob story, but hearing the truth about her motivations changed everything. My mother said she was proud of me for protecting my current family from Arya's manipulation. It's been 3 months since that last encounter, and I haven't heard from Arya since. Sometimes I wonder if I could have done something different, if there was a way to help her without enabling her destructive choices. But I know that the woman who came to my door wasn't really my daughter anymore. She was someone who'd been shaped by 10 years of entitlement and privilege into someone I don't recognize or trust. The consequences of our choices can take years to fully manifest. I'm 55 years old, a successful business owner, and 18 months ago I made a decision that almost destroyed my relationship with my adult children but ultimately saved them from becoming completely useless human beings. I'm still processing whether I'm a good father or a monster, but I needed to share this because the transformation I've witnessed has been nothing short of miraculous. My wife Patricia and I have been married for 29 years, and we have 2 children who are now 28 and 26. Caleb is our oldest, and Maya is 2 years younger. When they were growing up, Patricia and I were determined to give them everything we'd never had. I came from a working-class family where money was always tight, and I built my manufacturing business from nothing, working 80-hour weeks for years to establish financial security for my family. By the time Caleb and Maya were teenagers, we were wealthy enough to afford private schools, expensive vacations, and basically anything they wanted. I thought I was being a good father by making sure they never had to worry about money the way I had as a kid. We set up trust funds for both of them when they turned 18, giving them access to more money than most people make in a year. Looking back, that's probably where I made my first major mistake. Caleb and Maya went through college without ever having jobs, without ever worrying about student loans, without ever experiencing the kind of financial stress that teaches you the value of money. They studied whatever interested them without considering career prospects, because they knew they'd never actually need careers. After graduation, neither of them showed any interest in joining the family business or pursuing meaningful employment. Caleb spent his days playing video games, going to expensive restaurants with friends, and collecting vintage watches. Maya decided she wanted to be an influencer, which seemed to involve spending money on designer clothes and taking photos of herself for social media. For years, I told myself they were still figuring things out, that they'd eventually find their direction and want to contribute something meaningful to the world. I kept waiting for them to show some ambition, some desire to build something for themselves, but it never happened. They were content to live off their trust funds indefinitely. The conversation that changed everything happened during a family dinner about a year and a half ago. Patricia and I were discussing our retirement plans. Nothing serious, just thinking out loud about what we might want to do when we eventually stepped back from the business. I mentioned that ideally, one or both of the kids might take over the company someday, keeping it in the family. Caleb actually laughed out loud. He said he had no interest in spending his life in meetings and dealing with employees and customers. Maya made some sarcastic comment about how she was too busy building her brand to waste time on traditional business. I asked them what they planned to do with their lives long term, and they both just shrugged. Caleb said his trust fund generated enough income for him to live comfortably without working. Maya said she was pursuing her passion and didn't need to conform to society's expectations about traditional employment. That's when it hit me that I had failed completely as a father. My children were 28 and 26 years old, and they had no sense of purpose, no work ethic, no understanding that adults are supposed to contribute something to the world beyond their own entertainment. I spent the next few weeks thinking about what I could do to fix the situation I'd created. These weren't lazy teenagers anymore. These were full-grown adults who'd been enabled into complete uselessness, and I was partly responsible for that outcome. I decided to give them an ultimatum. At our next family dinner, I announced that I was changing the terms of their inheritance. They would no longer have access to any family money until they'd worked full-time jobs for at least 2 years. Real jobs, with real employers who weren't connected to our family or business network. Jobs where they'd have to show up on time, follow directions, and prove their value like everyone else in the world. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Caleb accused me of trying to control his life through financial manipulation. Maya started crying and said I was ruining everything she'd worked for, though I couldn't figure out what exactly she thought she'd worked for. They both acted like I was being completely unreasonable, like asking adults to support themselves was some kind of cruel punishment. Caleb said I was essentially blackmailing them into living a lifestyle they didn't want. Maya said I didn't understand modern career paths and that influencer work was just as valid as traditional employment. I tried to explain that this wasn't about punishment or control. I wanted them to experience the satisfaction of earning something for themselves, to develop skills and confidence that money couldn't buy. But they weren't interested in hearing about personal growth or character development. They just wanted me to reverse my decision and go back to funding their comfortable, meaningless lives. When they realized I wasn't budging, they started trying to manipulate other family members. Caleb called his grandparents, Patricia's parents, to complain about my financial abuse. Maya reached out to my siblings, claiming I was having some kind of midlife crisis that was destroying the family. Some relatives were sympathetic to their complaints. My brother thought I was being too harsh, that I should ease them into employment gradually instead of cutting them off completely. Patricia's mother said I was being cruel to my own children and that families should support each other unconditionally. But other family members, particularly those who'd worked their way up from nothing, were supportive of my decision. My sister said she'd been wondering for years when I was going to stop enabling Caleb and Maya's laziness. Patricia's father, who'd built his own successful career from scratch, said he wished more parents had the courage to teach their children about real-world consequences. The next few months were difficult for everyone. Caleb and Maya tried various schemes to avoid actually finding jobs. Caleb attempted day trading, convinced he could make quick money in the stock market without having to answer to an employer. He lost most of his remaining savings within weeks. Maya tried to monetize her social media presence more aggressively, but discovered that having a few thousand followers doesn't translate into sustainable income without legitimate business skills or unique content. When their individual schemes failed, they both became increasingly desperate and angry. They accused me of destroying their mental health, of setting them up for failure, of caring more about my principles than their well-being. There's something deeply satisfying about watching spoiled adults finally face consequences for their choices. Sometimes the cruelest kindness is forcing someone to discover what they're actually capable of when the safety net disappears. The turning point came when I cut off their monthly allowances completely. Up until then, they'd still been receiving regular payments from the trust funds I'd established, which gave them enough cushion to avoid taking their job searches seriously. Once that money stopped, they had to face the reality of paying rent and buying groceries with whatever resources they had left. Caleb was the first to crack. He swallowed his pride and took a job at a local manufacturing plant, doing assembly line work for $12 an hour. He hated every minute of it at first, complaining constantly about the early hours, the physical demands, and the supervisors who treated him like any other entry-level employee. Maya held out longer, convinced that some opportunity would present itself that would allow her to avoid traditional employment. But eventually, even she had to accept a position as a sales associate at a department store in the mall. The first few months were brutal for both of them. They'd call home regularly to complain about their jobs, their coworkers, their living situations. Caleb was sharing an apartment with 3 roommates for the first time in his life. Maya had to learn how to manage a budget and cook basic meals for herself. But gradually, something amazing started happening. They began taking pride in their work and their independence. Caleb got promoted to a team leader position after 6 months, and he was genuinely excited when he called to tell us about it. Maya discovered she was good at sales and started earning commission bonuses that made her feel accomplished in a way she'd never experienced before. More importantly, they started developing relationships with people who knew them as workers and colleagues, not as trust fund recipients. They made friends who valued them for their personalities and contributions rather than their ability to pick up dinner tabs or fund weekend trips. 18 months later, both Caleb and Maya are different people. They're still working their entry-level jobs, but they're also taking night classes and making plans for career advancement. Caleb is studying business management and talking about eventually starting his own company. Maya has discovered an interest in marketing and is considering going back to school for an MBA. Their relationship with each other has improved dramatically too. Instead of competing for family resources or comparing their purchases, they bond over work stories and support each other through challenges. They've developed empathy and understanding that only comes from facing real difficulties. Patricia and I are so proud of who they've become, even though the process of getting there was painful for everyone involved. We've started having meaningful conversations about their goals, their relationships, their perspectives on life. They're interesting people now, with experiences and opinions that go beyond their next vacation or shopping trip. I know some people think I was too harsh, that there must have been gentler ways to motivate my children toward independence. But I've watched too many wealthy families destroy their children with unlimited resources and no expectations. Caleb and Maya needed to discover what they were capable of, and they never would have made that discovery without being forced out of their comfort zones. The inheritance issue has become almost irrelevant now. They're both earning their own money and making their own decisions about how to spend it. When they eventually do inherit from Patricia and me, they'll have the wisdom and experience to handle that responsibility appropriately. Sometimes tough love really is the most loving thing you can do for someone, even when it feels cruel in the moment. My children are better people now because I stopped enabling their worst impulses and started expecting them to live up to their potential. The foundations of trust can crumble when we discover the people closest to us have been living completely different lives. I'm 35 years old, and for 17 years I thought I was living the American dream as a devoted husband and father. 6 months ago, I discovered that my entire adult life has been built on lies so elaborate and cruel that I'm still trying to process the level of betrayal involved. I ended up in the hospital with a heart attack from the stress, but honestly, that might have been the wake-up call that saved my life. Let me start from the beginning so you can understand how completely I was played. I met my wife Lauren when we were both 18, right out of high school. She was beautiful, charming, and seemed to want the same things I did. A stable family life with kids and a house in the suburbs. We got married when I was 20 and she was 19, and our first child was born a year later. From the start, I was the provider. I worked construction, then moved into warehouse management, always taking on overtime and extra shifts to make sure we could afford everything Lauren wanted for our growing family. She stayed home with the kids, which made sense when they were babies, and I was proud that my income could support that choice. Over the years, we had 3 more children, and Lauren never went back to work. She said the kids needed her at home, that childcare would cost more than she could earn anyway, that managing the household was a full-time job in itself. I believed her because I wanted to believe her, and because I was working so hard I didn't have time to really examine our division of labor. My typical day started at 5 in the morning. I'd let the dogs out, pack lunches for all 4 kids, make sure their backpacks and school supplies were ready, then head to my physically demanding job at a logistics company. I'd work until 6 or 7, pick up the kids from their various after-school activities, come home and cook dinner, help with homework, do bath time for the younger ones, and handle bedtime routines. Meanwhile, Lauren's days seemed to involve going to the gym, meeting friends for coffee, pursuing hobbies like crafting and jewelry making, and managing what she called the administrative side of running our household. She'd make doctor appointments and handle school communications, but most of the actual childcare fell to me during evenings and weekends. I told myself this was normal, that plenty of working fathers handled most of the parenting duties, and that Lauren deserved time for herself since she was home with the kids all day. I never questioned why she seemed so refreshed and energetic when I came home exhausted, or why the house was usually spotless when I'd left it messy that morning. The breaking point came 3 months ago, when Lauren announced that she wanted to take a 2-week vacation to Europe with her girlfriends. She'd already looked into flights and hotels, planned the itinerary, and was expecting me to cover the cost, which would have been about $4,000. The timing was terrible because I'd finally planned a long overdue weekend trip to visit my brother, who I hadn't seen in 2 years. It was just going to be a simple guy's weekend, fishing and catching up, but it was the first time I'd planned anything for myself in as long as I could remember. When I explained that her Europe trip conflicted with my weekend plans, Lauren acted like I was being completely unreasonable. She said she'd been planning this trip for months, even though she'd never mentioned it to me before, and that I could see my brother anytime. I pointed out that I could say the same thing about her friends, and that's when she said something that stopped me cold. She told me that I didn't understand how hard it was being home with the kids all day, that she deserved a real vacation after years of sacrifice, and that my little fishing weekend wasn't comparable to her need for genuine rest and relaxation. I stared at her, trying to process what I'd just heard. This woman who spent her days at yoga classes and lunch dates, who hadn't gotten up for a middle-of-the-night feeding or handled a sick kid in years, was telling me that she needed a break from her exhausting life. That's when I finally started paying attention to what was really happening in our household. I took a sick day the next week, telling Lauren I wasn't feeling well but really wanting to observe what she actually did when I wasn't around. She came downstairs at almost noon, seemingly surprised to find me home. When I said I'd taken a sick day, her first comment was about how we couldn't afford for me to miss work, how we needed every dollar I could earn. She made herself an elaborate breakfast while I sat on the couch, then spent an hour getting ready to go out. When I asked where she was going, she said she had plans with friends and suggested I rest since I was supposedly sick. I asked if she could stay home to take care of me, and she looked at me like I'd asked her to donate a kidney. She left around 2 in the afternoon and didn't come back until 9 that night, claiming she'd lost track of time while shopping and getting her nails done. During the entire day, she never once asked how I was feeling or offered to do anything to help me recover from my supposed illness. That night, I finally confronted her about the incredible imbalance in our relationship. I laid out everything I did versus everything she did, trying to help her see how unfairly the responsibilities were distributed. Instead of acknowledging the disparity, she got angry and accused me of not appreciating her contributions to our family. She said I didn't understand the mental load of managing a household, that I only saw the visible tasks and not the planning and organizing she did behind the scenes. When I asked for specific examples of this invisible labor, she couldn't provide any that I wasn't already handling myself. The argument escalated when I suggested that maybe she could get a part-time job to help with expenses, since the kids were all in school during the day. She said I was trying to punish her for being a devoted mother, that I obviously didn't value the sacrifice she'd made by giving up her career to raise our children. I pointed out that she'd never had a career to give up, that she'd been 19 when our first child was born and had never worked a full-time job. That's when she said something that made my blood boil. She told me that if I was so unhappy with our arrangement, maybe I should find someone else who would appreciate having a husband who could provide for his family. 2 days later, our 16-year-old son Marcus came to me with something that changed everything. He was clearly upset and said he needed to tell me something important, but was afraid it would hurt me. After a lot of coaxing, he finally revealed that he'd accidentally walked in on Lauren making what he described as inappropriate videos in our living room. When he'd asked her what she was doing, she'd told him she was trying to make extra money for the family because my income wasn't enough to cover our expenses. She'd made him promise not to tell me because I would be embarrassed and hurt that she had to supplement our household income. I felt like the room was spinning. I pressed Marcus for more details, and he admitted that he'd seen Lauren setting up cameras and lighting equipment multiple times when he came home early from school. She'd told him I knew about her online business, but was sensitive about it, so they should keep it between themselves. The next day, while Lauren was out, I searched our computer and found her OnlyFans account. She'd been making content for over 2 years, earning thousands of dollars a month that she'd been keeping in a separate bank account I knew nothing about. All those afternoons when I thought she was socializing with friends, she'd been running a lucrative business while telling me we couldn't afford basic expenses. The discovery that my wife had been lying to me about working was devastating enough, but it got worse. I found messages between her and her subscribers that were far more explicit than anything I'd imagined. She'd been engaging in private video calls, selling personal items, even meeting some of these men in person while I was at work and the kids were at school. The betrayal was so complete and systematic that I couldn't wrap my head around it. For years, I'd been killing myself to provide for a family while my wife made more money than me by selling access to her body, all while manipulating our teenage son into keeping her secrets. But the worst discovery was still to come. Going through her messages, I found conversations about our children that made me sick. She'd been complaining to her customers about how much she hated being tied down by kids, how she couldn't wait for them to be old enough that she could leave and start over somewhere else. She'd even made comments about how she wasn't sure some of the kids were really mine, joking with her subscribers about how she'd been adventurous during her younger years and maybe I was raising someone else's children without knowing it. The stress of these discoveries sent me to the hospital with what the doctors said was a significant heart attack. While I was recovering, Lauren played the role of concerned wife, but I noticed she seemed more worried about how my medical bills would affect her lifestyle than about my actual health. That's when I decided to get DNA tests for all 4 children. The results confirmed my worst fears. Only Marcus, our oldest, was biologically mine. The other 3 children I'd been raising, supporting, and loving for years belonged to other men. Lauren had been systematically deceiving me about the most fundamental aspects of our life together. She'd made me believe I was the father of children who weren't mine while using my money to support them and her secret lifestyle. She'd manipulated our son into keeping her sexual business secret while claiming I wasn't providing adequately for the family. The divorce is almost finalized now, and the DNA results have significantly changed the custody and financial arrangements. My in-laws, Lauren's parents, have been incredibly supportive of me throughout this process. They're disgusted by their daughter's behavior and have maintained relationships with me and Marcus. Lauren has tried to paint herself as the victim, claiming I'm abandoning her and the children during a difficult time. She's told people that I'm being vindictive and cruel by letting DNA results affect my feelings toward kids I helped raise. But I can't get past the level of deception involved, the years of lies that built our entire relationship. Marcus has chosen to live with me, and we're both in therapy trying to process what we've learned about the person we thought we knew best in the world. He's struggling with guilt about keeping his mother's secrets, and I'm working through my anger about being manipulated for 17 years. I'm healthier now than I've been in years, physically and emotionally. It turns out that when you're not working yourself to death to support someone who's actively betraying you, life becomes much more manageable. I have energy for the relationship with my son that actually matters, and I'm slowly learning what it feels like to be in authentic relationships where people actually care about your well-being. The deepest wounds often come from those we trusted most completely. I'm 27 years old, and 3 months ago, the person I trusted most in the world took the most painful thing that ever happened to me and used it as a weapon to destroy my life. I'm sharing this because I'm completely isolated now and need to get this out somewhere, even if it's just to strangers on the internet who might understand what it feels like to have your trauma become someone else's ammunition. I've been married to Elena for 6 years, and until recently I thought we had the kind of relationship where you could tell each other anything. We met in college, dated for 3 years before getting married, and built what I believed was a solid partnership based on trust and mutual support. Elena knew I had some issues with intimacy and anxiety, but I'd never told her or anyone else the real reason why. When I was 9 years old, I was repeatedly sexually abused by my teenage babysitter. The details don't matter for this story, but it went on for months and completely screwed up my understanding of boundaries, consent, and my own worth. When I finally tried to tell my parents what was happening, they didn't believe me. My dad actually hit me for making up disgusting lies, and my mom grounded me for seeking attention through inappropriate stories. I tried telling friends as I got older, thinking maybe adults outside my family would take me seriously. Instead, my male friends told me I was lucky to have gotten action so young, and my female friends accused me of lying for sympathy or attention. By the time I was in high school, I'd learned that my trauma was something to keep buried, that nobody wanted to hear it, and most people wouldn't believe it anyway. I managed to build a relatively normal adult life despite carrying this secret. I went to college, started a career in marketing, met Elena, got married, bought a house. I had some lingering issues with intimacy and trust, but Elena was patient and understanding without knowing the full scope of what I was dealing with. I thought I'd successfully moved past my childhood and didn't need to drag those painful memories into my marriage. 3 months ago, Elena wanted to watch this Netflix show called Baby Reindeer that everyone was talking about. I knew it dealt with stalking and sexual abuse, but I thought I could handle it. I'd seen plenty of movies and TV shows with difficult content before without having major reactions. I was wrong. By the 4th episode, I was having what I can only describe as a complete breakdown. All the memories I'd spent years suppressing came flooding back with an intensity that left me shaking and crying on our couch. Elena paused the show and asked what was wrong, and for the first time in almost 20 years, I told someone the complete truth about what had happened to me as a child. Elena's immediate response seemed supportive. She held me while I cried, told me she was sorry I'd gone through that, said she was glad I'd finally felt safe enough to tell her. We went to bed that night, and I felt this enormous sense of relief. Like I'd finally shared this burden with the person who was supposed to love me unconditionally. But over the next few days, something changed in Elena's behavior toward me. She stopped initiating physical contact, stopped kissing me goodbye when she left for work, started acting distant and uncomfortable around me. When I tried to talk to her about it, she claimed nothing was wrong and that I was being paranoid. A week after I'd opened up to her, we got into an argument about something completely unrelated, some stupid disagreement about whose turn it was to handle a household chore. But instead of staying focused on the actual issue, Elena said something that stopped me cold. She looked me right in the eye and said, "At least I'm not lying about being raped, you narcissist." I couldn't process what I'd just heard. The person I'd trusted with my deepest trauma had just weaponized it against me in the cruelest way possible. I started crying and tried to explain how much her words had hurt me, but she just rolled her eyes and said I was being dramatic. When I pressed her about why she'd said something so vicious, Elena doubled down. She said my story was too convenient, too perfectly timed with the TV show we'd watched. She accused me of making up childhood sexual abuse to get attention and sympathy, of trying to manipulate her emotions to win arguments. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I tried to remind her that she'd known I had intimacy issues long before we watched that show, that my reaction had been genuine trauma response, not some calculated performance. But Elena had already decided I was lying, and nothing I said could change her mind. The conversation ended with Elena slapping me across the face when I wouldn't stop trying to explain myself. She told me to stop pathetically pretending to be a victim and to grow up. Then she went upstairs and locked herself in our bedroom, leaving me alone with the realization that my wife not only didn't believe my trauma, but was actively using it to hurt me. Things spiraled quickly after that. Elena started telling our friends that I had anger issues, that I'd been acting strangely and making up stories for attention. She presented herself as a concerned wife who was worried about my mental health, while simultaneously undermining everything I said to our mutual friends. Within 2 weeks, most of our social circle was treating me differently. People who'd been friendly before started avoiding me at gatherings or giving me these concerned, pitying looks like I was an unstable person they needed to handle carefully. Elena took her campaign beyond our friend group. She contacted my employer and told them I was having psychological problems that were affecting my work performance. She provided them with what she claimed was evidence of my instability, including recordings of me crying about my childhood abuse, which she presented as proof that I was making up disturbing stories for attention. My boss called me in for a meeting and explained that they'd received some concerning information about my mental state. They suggested I take some time off to get professional help, and when I tried to defend myself, they made it clear that my job was in jeopardy if I didn't comply with their recommendation for psychological evaluation. I felt like I was living in a nightmare. The woman I'd married, the person who was supposed to support me through difficult times, had taken the most vulnerable thing I'd ever shared and used it to systematically destroy my reputation and career. The worst part was how Elena managed to position herself as the victim in all of this. She told people that I was emotionally abusing her, that I was using false accusations and manipulation to control her, that she was afraid of what I might do if she tried to leave me. She convinced my own family that I was having some kind of breakdown. When I tried to explain what was really happening, they told me that Elena had already warned them I might try to turn them against her with lies and manipulation. She'd poisoned every relationship in my life by getting there first with her version of events. I ended up losing my job when I refused to admit that I'd fabricated my childhood abuse. My employer decided I was too much of a liability to keep around, especially with Elena providing them with ongoing updates about my supposed psychological deterioration. Most of our friends chose Elena's side, either because they believed her version of events or because they didn't want to get involved in what they saw as messy marital drama. The few people who might have supported me were convinced that Elena was the victim, and I was the unstable abuser. I filed for divorce and moved out of our house, but even that became another weapon Elena used against me. She told people that I'd abandoned her during a difficult time, that I'd proven I was exactly the kind of person who would make up trauma stories to avoid taking responsibility for my actions. The legal process has been a nightmare because Elena has documented everything in a way that makes me look like the aggressor. She has recordings of me crying and talking about wanting to die, which she presents as evidence that I'm emotionally unstable and potentially dangerous. She has witness statements from friends who testify that I've been acting erratically and making wild accusations against her. I'm now living in a studio apartment, working a part-time job that barely covers my expenses, and dealing with the reality that almost everyone I cared about believes I'm a liar and an abuser. The few people who still talk to me treat me like I'm fragile and potentially unstable. Elena has moved on quickly, already dating someone new and presenting herself as a survivor of psychological abuse who's bravely rebuilding her life. She posts on social media about the importance of supporting abuse victims, which is particularly twisted, given what she did to me when I revealed my own abuse history. I've been in therapy trying to process not just my original childhood trauma, but this new betrayal that somehow feels even more devastating. My therapist says that having your trauma weaponized by someone you trust is a particularly cruel form of psychological abuse, but knowing that doesn't make it hurt less. The hardest part is the isolation. Elena didn't just leave me. She made sure I'd have nothing and no one left when she was done destroying my reputation. She understood that the best way to hurt someone who'd already been disbelieved about abuse was to make sure they'd never be believed about anything again. I don't know how to rebuild from this. Every new person I meet, every potential employer, every possible friend, exists in a world where Elena's version of our story is the accepted truth. I'm the unstable ex-husband who made up sexual abuse to manipulate his poor wife. And she's the brave survivor who escaped from my psychological manipulation. Sometimes I wonder if everyone was right all along, if trauma survivors like me are just too damaged to have healthy relationships. Elena certainly convinced a lot of people that my childhood abuse had turned me into someone who couldn't be trusted with the truth about my own experiences. But I know what happened to me, both as a child and in my marriage. I know that Elena took my vulnerability and used it to destroy my life with surgical precision. I know that the people who claim to love us sometimes reveal themselves to be capable of unimaginable cruelty. I'm trying to build a new life with the understanding that some people will use your deepest pain against you if it serves their purposes. Elena taught me that sometimes the most dangerous person in your life is the one who knows exactly where you're most vulnerable and isn't afraid to attack you there. As we reach the end of tonight's journey through these painful human experiences, and there we have it. Another journey through the complicated landscape of human relationships and the boundaries we sometimes have to draw to protect ourselves. Tonight we've witnessed fathers who had to choose between their children's comfort and their character, siblings whose love became conditional on compliance, and partners whose support evaporated the moment it was truly needed. These stories might be difficult to process, but they serve an important purpose. They remind us that setting boundaries isn't cruelty, it's survival. They show us that sometimes the people who claim to love us are really just using us for their own purposes. And perhaps most importantly, they demonstrate that walking away from toxic situations, no matter how painful, is often the bravest thing we can do. If you're lying here in the quiet hours thinking about your own relationships, remember that you deserve people in your life who see your worth without needing to be convinced of it. You deserve support that doesn't come with strings attached, and love that doesn't require you to sacrifice your well-being to earn it. If these stories helped you feel less alone tonight, if they gave you permission to protect your own peace of mind, consider hitting that subscribe button. There are always more tales waiting in the depths of human experience. More reminders that choosing yourself isn't selfish. Until next time, remember that your boundaries are not suggestions. They're requirements. Sweet dreams, and thank you for spending these quiet hours exploring the complexities of family, trust, and the courage it takes to demand better for yourself.